Has martyrdom ever been important in Shinto history?
Shinto tradition reveres many religious heroes who died defending their emperor and homeland. They are martyrs in the broadest sense of the term. They died not for a religious creed narrowly defined, but out of allegiance to the larger complex of beliefs that has been integral to Japanese history and culture. People like the cultural icon Sugawara Michizane, who is said to have perished as a result of his convictions, take their place alongside the royal heroes, the princes who died in defense of the imperial house. Shrines designated as nation-protecting shrines are dedicated to the memory of war dead. They enshrine as kami the souls of all who gave their lives out of conviction. Yasukuni Jinja in Tokyo is a fine example of such a martyr memorial.
Is there such a thing as converting into Confucianism?
Since Confucian tradition has been so deeply identified with Chinese culture, the notion of converting into the tradition is virtually meaningless. That is not to say that individuals have not been so highly attracted to the teachings of the tradition that they espoused it as a philosophy of life. But so much of Confucianism is inseparable from such practices as ancestor veneration and other culturally rooted behavior, that the likelihood of conversion is very small. In addition, over the centuries most people one might identify as Confucian have more than likely been associated with other religious traditions as well, such as Daoism, CCT, or Buddhism. In Chinese religious history, and Japanese too, the more or less tidy distinctions many Europeans and Americans are used to making between religious communities simply have not been applicable.
Is there a central teaching authority for Christians? What is a pope?
Not since very early in Christian history have all, or at least the vast majority of, Christians acknowledged a central temporal authority. The role of the papacy through the centuries has been central to the story of pre-Reformation Christendom especially, and even churches that eventually repudiated papal authority were indirectly acknowledged the importance of the institution. Roman Catholic tradition is structured around the institution of the papacy. Popes have exercised varying degrees of independence in their governance, depending on the will and vigor of the Church's bishops in any given period. Eastern Orthodox churches have had their unique authority structures in the form of a federation of 14 independent autocephalies, 4 of which are the patriarchates of early Christian times, each further divided into eparchies, or dioceses. Since the Reformation, proliferation of Christian churches and denominations has spurred the development of a variety of governance styles and systems within individual denominations, such as the Baptist, and even their sub-denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention. Governing bodies do not always exercise overall prescriptive control. Their central authority is in many cases largely advisory. Since local church communities in many denominations enjoy considerable autonomy, both structurally and financially.
Is ritual sacrifice part of Shinto tradition?
According to Shinto tradition, the kami neither require nor ask for sacrificial offerings. Sacrifices in many traditions imply the need to assuage guilt or undo an evil action. Shinto tradition focuses on impurities that one can overcome merely by sincere purification. Some rituals in Shinto history have included animal sacrifice. Perhaps under the influence of imported Chinese practices. But that did not become a regular feature of Shinto worship.
Where and how do religious traditions employ signs and symbols?
Everything from buildings to sacred books to substances like oil and incense play important roles in the everyday lives of religious practitioners. Primary ritual spaces are naturally the most prominent venues for the use of signs and symbols. Temples, synagogues, mosques, and shrines are often visual galleries, filled with sensory input composed entirely of signs and symbols. Architectural style and structure incorporate forms characteristic of each tradition, including towers of various kinds, domes, courtyards, rooms for special functions, and gathering spaces designed to accommodate certain activities and groups of a certain size. Everything about a well-executed ritual space expresses the tradition's beliefs. In their homes, too, religious persons often use signs and symbols to remind themselves of their central spiritual values. Some go so far as to set up elaborate household shrines or altars at which to conduct their private devotions. In certain societies, one can still readily identify members of some religious traditions by the signs and symbols they wear. For the majority of people who so identify themselves, signs and symbols of faith are at least as much a reminder to themselves of their faith commitment as they are a signal to others that they hold certain things sacred.
Has pilgrimage ever figured prominently in Jewish practice?
In biblical times, Jewish males were expected to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem for 3 occasions: the feasts of Passover, booths, and weeks. Special ritual requirements attended each of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. But since all were tied to the existence of the temple, pilgrimage as a specific religious duty lapsed during the exile and again when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. Throughout post-biblical Jewish history, Jews in the diaspora have continued to pray about Jerusalem and have longed to return to it. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, many have realized the dream of one day visiting the site of the temple and praying at the Western Wall. Strictly speaking, modern-day Jewish pilgrims are not fulfilling a biblical injunction, since the temple remains only a memory. But pilgrimage has in effect assumed a new form for many Jews. For most it is a journey of remembrance of a former dispensation and a chance to connect with deep roots. Some journey in the hope that they may live to see the glory of the temple and its associated ritual practices restored.
Where does academic regalia come from?
Early every student who graduates from high school or college makes a passing connection with Confucian tradition. Academic robes with their wide flowing sleeves are at least vaguely similar to those worn by Confucian ritual leaders even today in places like Taiwan and Korea when they celebrate the master's birthday or honor royal ancestors. But one look at the headgear and the viewer knows instantly where the so-called mortar board came from. Principal participants in important Confucian rituals sport large flat rectangular boards worn with flat sides, rather than corners, as in common graduation practice now, facing the wearer's front, back, and sides. Confucian mortar boards outdid modern ones in ornamentation, with rows of tassels all along the front and back edges.
What were the accomplishments of the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907 CE, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It is well known because the period saw great achievements in government and business as well as in letters and the arts. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches. The Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies. The Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored the bureaucracy. And the Department of States and Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. One of the most forward-thinking developments of the Tang dynasty was the growth of a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an examination that would qualify them for official duty.
What signs or symbols distinguish ritual specialists in Judaism?
Since the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70, there has been no formal Jewish priesthood. With the priesthood, several other special ranks of ritual specialists disappeared. What replaced the priesthood was a more egalitarian system of rabbinical leadership. Nowadays, when Jews worship together, the community leader is not nearly so visually distinctive as in days of old. Since the nature of post-temple worship is radically different, leaders in worship are visually distinguishable largely by their being in front on the congregation, often on a raised stage. Temple priests once wore easily recognizable garb. In addition to the simpler vesture of the ordinary priests, with a full-length cloak and sash or girdle. The high priest's cloak had a hem fringed with gold bells and woolen pomegranates. He also wore a tall mitre with a blue band at the top and a gold headband. An elaborately decorated vestment called the ephod was worn over the cloak. Over that the high priest wore the breastplate suspended from the shoulders. Like a large pendant on a necklace hung down the front from epaulette like onyx stones, on each of which were written the names of 6 of the 12 tribes. Attached to the breastplate were 12 semi-precious stones symbolizing the tribes. And inside the breastplate pocket were the Urim and Thummim, mysterious devices used for divination.
Is belief the same as faith?
There is a distinction between belief and faith. Belief, understood either generally or as a reference to a particular tenet, refers to the content of a tradition's central teaching. When believers recite a creed, for example, they affirm that they share a certain set of beliefs. Faith is the act or process of relying on or assenting to realities that one might not be able to prove as easily as one might like. People talk about acts of faith and often describe faith as a leap into the unknown, or as a kind of fundamental trust. Not every belief or act of faith is necessarily religious. Beliefs of every description rule our daily lives. They all the millions of things we take for granted, like gravity and sunrise. And no one could get past breakfast without a basic level of trust. Religious belief and faith can seem riskier, because their objects are often not subject to the validation of actual experience. But what finally distinguishes religious belief and faith from their more mundane counterparts is that religious believers are willing to live without conclusive proof indefinitely.
Have there been any deist mystics?
Traditional accounts of many famous deists describe their inner experiences in terms consistent with those often associated with mysticism. A mystic, in general terms, is a human being who through a variety of ritual or devotional practices experiences spiritual transcendence. Moving out of and beyond himself or herself, the mystic abides at least temporarily in a dimension very different from what most people experience most of the time. Some refer to the great deist figures as nature mystics since they enter into that different dimension by contemplating nature. They experience oneness with the cosmos intuitively rather than by reasoning their way to an intellectual conclusion. In a trance-like state, the mystic loses all sense of selfhood and individuality, becoming one with the Deo. Some have referred to the experience as the fast of the mind, in which one listens with the ears of the spirit. What exactly the experience feels like, deist sources are reluctant to say. But they readily offer advice about how to cultivate the experience. By way of exception, some deist sources also hint that the occasional mystic has experienced a somewhat more personal form of union with the divine, akin to what Hindu and other traditions call theistic mysticism.
Are there mythic elements in Buddhist tradition?
Mythic expression plays a far less central role in Buddhist teaching than in Hinduism. In fact, you might say one of the Buddha's main concerns was to demythologize Hindu tradition as he had received it. Hindu myth introduces believers to the impenetrable mystery of the divine while attempting to describe how the divine presence infuses the world of human experience. The Buddha cautioned against taking refuge in myth. However potent the divine presence may be, it does not relieve human beings of ultimate responsibility for their own choices. As in so many religious traditions, the foundational figure himself soon became the focal point of a new mythology. Even the most hardcore Theravada tradition leaves room for the Buddha to expand into a being of supermundane qualities. Wondrous tales of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jatakas, radiate mythic energy. Some of the Mahayana denominations and sects, those of the widely popular Pure Land variety in particular, evolved their own complex descriptions of a multi-level cosmos, ruled by multiple Buddhas and populated by countless lesser spiritual powers as well. Vajrayana Buddhism, represented especially by various Tibetan lineages, retained much of ancient Hinduism's mythic spirit and cast of characters. But the Tibetans interiorized the myth, interpreting the many spiritual beings as projections of the inner powers with which one identifies through meditative practice. Even in popular Mahayana and the more esoteric Vajrayana teachings, mythic elements never attain quite the centrality they enjoy in Hindu tradition.
How does the agricultural cycle affect Shinto-related ritual celebrations?
Many festivities are still tied to various agricultural occasions. Spring and autumn festivals correspond with planting and harvesting. A large cluster of so-called spring festivals, Harumatsuri, covers events that run generally from January to May, though some areas stretch the season into July. In late March or April people celebrate Cherry Blossom Festival, one of nature's sublime but fleeting glories. On May 5th, 5th of the 5th in some places, other days elsewhere, many people observe a special rice planting day. Two of Kyoto's larger shrines, Kamigamo and Shimogamo in the north of the city, celebrate a prayer for good harvest called Hollyhock Festival, Aoi Matsuri, complete with elaborate processions and reenactments of ancient imperial events. With countless regional variations, the planting, or transplanting, rites occur generally during May, June, and July, stretching well into the summer season. This seasonal overlap is a result of using more than one system for converting special occasions from the lunar to the solar calendar. Some shrines host enormous gatherings centered around processions and contests of various kinds. Autumn festivals, Aki Matsuri, include a similar grouping of celebrations that begin even before the summer festival season has ended and extend into October. At the beginning of each imperial era, the new emperor performs an autumn celebration called the Great Feast of New Food, Daijasai, offering rice to the sun goddess and imperial forebears. Whether in the imperial palace or at local shrines, these are all occasions for gratitude to the kami for bountiful harvest. Between planting and harvest are a host of generally smaller summer festivals. Natsumatsuri, during which people pray for a healthy crop. Some shrines, however, still host major celebrations during July, August, and September. Many of these are occasions for teams of younger men and boys especially to engage in spirited competition, vying to get their mikoshi along the procession route faster and arrive at the shrine first. Winter festivals. Fuyu no Matsuri, revolve largely around preparations for the end of the year and New Year's celebrations, Shogesu. Calculated on the solar calendar, the winter solstice heralds the new year. So many people begin them with ceremonial cleaning and wrap up the old year by laying old sewing needles to rest at a local shrine. Honor for all things that contribute to human civilization, not for human beings alone that have come to the end of their lives, is essential. 7 days during a period called the Great Cold, Daikon, generally between January 6th and 21st, retain some of their ancient associations. People gather at shrines to enjoy the return of the sun in lengthening days that portend spring, and to pray for good fortune in general.
Who are the Vaishnavites?
About half the world's Hindus belong to the various sub-denominations of Vaishnavism. In general, northern Vaishnavas understand Vishnu as a form of Krishna, while most southerners think of either Rama or Krishna as forms of Vishnu. 5 major Vaishnava schools trace their origins to famous founders who lived between about 1000 and 1500 CE. Different ways of describing the divine-human relationship mark the principal distinctions. Among the 5 denominations and the various sectarian divisions that have arisen from them. Ramanuj, 1017–1137, was a major figure in a predominantly southern school called Sri Vaishnavism. So called because of the centrality of Vishnu's consort Sri. Ramanuj taught a modified form of non-dualism, called Vishishtadvaita, according to which individual souls are aspects of the divine, part of God, but retain their individuality and do not lose their identity in their union with the divine. Madhva, 1197–1278, disagreed, insisting on a fuller distinction between the human and the divine. His teaching is a type of pure theism in which God freely chooses to reach with love and grace across an infinite and otherwise unbridgeable chasm. Madhva's dualist, Dvaita, branch is also primarily a southern tradition, while the remaining 3 are more popular in the north. Nimbarka, 1125–1162, focused on the role of the Guru as the central means of grace in his Mainandi school. Vallabha, 1475–1530, taught a form of pure non-dualism, also called panentheism, God in all things. His commentaries on the Bhagavata Purana detail his mystical interpretation of the so-called love games of Krishna, in which the Lord's romance with the gopis becomes a model of the human quest for the divine beloved and vice versa. Chaitanya, 1485–1534, preached devotion to Krishna and Radha through communal dance and song. Of the several contemporary subsects of his Gaudiya Vaishnava group, perhaps the best known is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
What is the Star of David?
Known in Hebrew as Magen David, Shield of David. This important Jewish symbol is composed of 2 superimposed equilateral triangles forming a hexagram. The symbol was common in many ancient civilizations and cultures, where it served variously for decoration and for the practice of magic. The star was not associated specifically with Judaism during biblical or Talmudic times. It appeared as early as the 10th century as a lucky sign in mezuzah. And later around the 17th century it began appearing on Jewish tombstones and as decoration in synagogues. In the 19th century, the appearance of the star became widespread when it was adopted by Central European Jews as a symbol to represent Judaism, much as the cross represents Christianity. The symbol spread quickly and was in use in most synagogues by the early years of the 20th century. In 1897 the First Zionist Congress adopted the star. Later, it was utilized as the central image of the flag of the State of Israel. During the Nazi period, Jews in Europe were forced to wear a Magen David as an identifying badge.
Do Daists and practitioners of CCT believe in miracles?
Devout Chinese, whether associated with Daoism or with some form of CCT. Consider asking for special favors an ordinary part of being religious. In general, however, what many readers mean by the term miraculous would not quite describe. Even apparently spectacular results of supplicatory prayer and ritual in this context. A fundamental consequence of the yin/yang view of life is the conviction that there is an identifiable cause of everything, whether positive or negative. All evil, illness, and suffering is a result of disharmony and imbalance. It is true that ordinary people cannot always put their finger on the direct cause. But ritual specialists know about these things. More importantly, the gods and those spiritual beings who have found the secret of immortality can assist suffering humankind by bringing about needed balance and harmony of forces. A miracle in this context, therefore, might be a divine intervention not for the purpose of doing the impossible, but for helping the possible to happen more quickly and easily.
What does the term hierarchy mean? Which Christian groups are the most hierarchically structured? Which are the least?
Hierarchy comes from the Greek words for sacred leadership. Church organizations vary from predominantly egalitarian and democratic to highly structured and institutionalized. Even the most egalitarian tend to feature some sort of division of labor within their leadership. But they typically choose leaders from among the rank and file members. Roman Catholicism is perhaps the most hierarchically structured of the churches. A leader, called the Pope or Holy Father, has been elected since the Middle Ages, by a body called the College of Cardinals. The Pope is the ecclesiastical descendant of Peter and the custodian of apostolic tradition. Cardinals are specially appointed by the Pope from among the bishops and archbishops. Another rank of clerics have the honorific title of Monsignor, a designation until recently further divided into those called Right Reverend and a lower rank called Very Reverend. The office of priest, from which the upper levels of the hierarchy are taken, consists of men responsible for the day-to-day life of the Church in its thousands of parishes. Another office, that of deacon, is just below that of priest. Men studying for the priesthood are ordained as temporary deacons, but more recently the office of permanent deacon has been made up of laymen chosen and trained for the work of assisting parish priests. Several other churches retain a highly structured organization, but generally on a smaller scale. For example, many have archbishops and bishops as main administrators. Many of the Eastern Orthodox churches are governed by patriarchs, to whom archbishops, or metropolitans, and bishops report.
What is a beatitude?
A beatitude is a blessing proclaimed by Jesus in the New Testament, Matthew 5:3-11, Luke 6:20-23. Commending a characteristic of life that is most precious and dear to God. Jesus pronounced the Beatitudes at the very beginning of his public ministry. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Blessed are those persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Must a Jew live in Israel? Similarly, what is the role and importance of a Jewish state? Of a concentration of Jews in a secular nation?
The establishment of the State of Israel in the wake of World War II renewed and shifted the debate. Today, the autonomy of Israel is accepted by many nations. But the debate concerning the rights of Arab settlers in Israel rages on.
What is the nature of the human person in Confucian tradition?
Chinese uses the word "seen" to describe human nature in its most fundamental form. The term combines the concepts of life/progeny with heart/mind. The two basic constituents of the person. Confucius further described the fully developed person using the term ren, a Chinese word that combines the characters for human being and two. A full person, therefore, is one who exists in society, in communication with others. Human beings are always works in progress, ever shaping themselves in pursuit of an elusive goal of perfection. Ren, sometimes translated as goodness, human-heartedness, or even love, is that which activates the other four of the so-called five great virtues: devotion, justice, wisdom, and propriety. Only in light of Ren does law function properly, as a guide rather than as a straitjacket. Ren's two components, Yung, individual, and Shu, the virtue of reciprocity, allow human beings to enact the principles known as the mean, the ability to hold feelings in abeyance, and the measure, by which one can express emotions in balance.
What is the principal Confucian virtue?
Behind all the other virtues, what makes a good Confucian tick is filial devotion, or xiao. The Chinese term is composed of sun with old placed above it. Confucius taught that all other moral virtue, and indeed civilization itself, flows from filial devotion. As a bare minimum, one should do no harm to one's parents. Filial devotion culminates in doing one's family proud. Traditional texts go into great detail about how one ought to treat parents. Summarizing ideal behavior in 5 duties: reverence always, joyful service, solicitude for ailing parents, sincere grief at a parent's death, and proper ritual veneration thereafter. Lack of filial devotion was a most serious offense. Individuals could be put to death for cursing their elders. Filial devotion was the very bedrock of social order, a fundamental acknowledgement of authority on the family level, without which there could be no exercise of authority in society at large. Chinese tradition regards society as built on the family. Sons and daughters do not go out into the world as they reach maturity. Rather than leaving the nest, they invest themselves in the family, knowing that their children will do the same. Only in that way can the foundations of society as a whole remain firm.
What does Shinto home worship entail?
Religiously committed Japanese families still maintain regular daily home rituals centered around the Kamidana, and perhaps also around the Butsudan or miniature Buddhist temple. Home shrines are dedicated and put into service when family members invite a priest over to install a talisman from the local shrine on which is written the name of the kami to be honored in the home. Worshippers perform a brief purification ritual and then do before the miniature shrine much the same thing they would do at an actual shrine. These rituals, often observed morning and evening, are generally very brief, lasting perhaps 3 to 5 minutes. Some families still ritually incorporate in the evening meal food offered to the kami.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Confucian?
Confucian tradition consists far more of actions and the preservation of proper relationships than on the expression of specific doctrines. The tradition so pervades Chinese and other Asian cultures that it is like the air one breathes, rather than a distinct set of beliefs. As a result, it is virtually impossible to tell who among Chinese, Japanese, or Koreans think of themselves as Confucians. There are still some people who identify themselves as disciples of the master, but they are relatively few in number. Since so many rituals that Chinese and other East Asians perform are common to members of various religious traditions, the fact that an individual practiced ancestor veneration, for example, offers no clues in this regard. There are, however, a number of symbols connected with daily life originally associated with Confucius that still appear in popular arts of Asia. The so-called 4 treasures of the literary apartment, for example, include an ink stick, ink block, brush, and paper.
Does Shinto tradition include pilgrimage?
Pilgrimages of various kinds have long been important to Japanese in connection with both Buddhism and Shinto. Sacred natural objects and shrines are of course the most common goals of Shinto pilgrims. But people do not always make neat distinctions between Buddhist and Shinto sacred sites. What is most significant is that the place has been hallowed by some event or person of great influence in Japanese history, or by natural qualities that betoken beauty and perfection. A distinctive aspect of Japanese pilgrimage is the formation of pilgrimage circuits, junpai, that encompass multiple stops at sacred groves, mountains, caves, waterfalls, shrines or temples, in all imaginable combinations. Most common are circuits of either 33 or 88 sites set up in relatively recent times by railway and other transportation companies. In medieval times there was even talk of 1,000 shrine pilgrimages. Senja-mairi, with multiple visits motivated by desire for greater spiritual merit. Some pilgrims undertake their journeys as acts of asceticism or spiritual discipline, but most seem to regard pilgrimage as an opportunity for reflection and spiritual renewal. A type of pilgrimage to Shinto's most sacred site, the Ise Shrine, has come to be known as the Blessing Visit, Okage-mairi. Another popular pilgrimage circuit leaves by rail from Osaka and takes in sites associated with the 7 gods of good luck, including both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. Over 400 traditional pilgrimage routes still attract Japanese Buddhist and Shinto devotees.
Why are gender issues important in understanding religion?
Gender roles are significant everywhere on planet Earth, both religiously and socially. A common pattern is that gender roles deeply rooted in local custom gradually acquire religious justification. With the added weight of sacred authority, social change becomes considerably more traumatic and threatening, especially in ostensibly male-dominated societies. Gender roles, both social and religious, have a great deal to do with the exercise of power. Religious rhetoric invariably canonizes the social status quo in the interest of greater stability, arguing that time-honored gender-based divisions of labor are divinely ordained. To tamper with the balance in quest of gender equality is to court disaster. Traditionalists argue, sweeping change is never easy, when it seems to imply major shifts in the exercise of religious authority, it can be excruciating. Dramatic realignments are afoot now all over the world, yielding slow improvements in the social standing of women and children. Those changes will inevitably manifest themselves in the social structures of religious communities everywhere. It is likely that 50 years hence scholars will be adding important new chapters to the history of religion. Chapters in which women's roles will be much more evident.
How do Shaivites honor Shiva?
Shivaratri, Shiva's night, is a monthly festivity occurring on the 14th night of the dark half of every lunar month, just before the appearance of the new moon. Once a year devotees observe Mahashivaratri, Shiva's great night, either during the midwinter lunar month called Magha or during the following month, Falguna, depending on regional custom. The feast celebrates Shiva's manifestation of his power and glory to Vishnu and Brahma in the icon called the Jyotirlinga or fiery linga. Girls who hope to marry soon often fast during the day and keep vigil all night. Festivities in parts of India generally last all night and often include massive street parties and processions featuring elaborate floats, ecstatic dancing, and sometimes extreme demonstrations of devotion in the form of self-mutilation. A full moon feast during Kartika, in the fall, is called Tripuri Purnima. It recalls how Shiva incinerated the demon Tripura's 3 cities, Tripuri, made of gold, silver, and iron. Meanwhile his consort Kali dispatched the demon himself, ending his partial dominion over heaven, earth, and hell, the 3 cities.
Are number and letter symbolism important in Jewish tradition?
Rabbinical interpreters of the sacred text have always loved to play with words. That is not so surprising in a tradition that teaches that words are so powerful that to speak a word is to bring its meaning into being as an event. Writers of Agada learned narrative intended to entertain as well as teach analyzed words or clusters of words in the text at hand, looking for hidden meanings. Every letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value, and the interpreters would, for example, count up the total numerical value of certain words in order to decide where to place their emphasis in interpreting a passage. This type of interpretation is based on a system called gematria, from the Greek word for geometry, and was especially associated with a kind of often arcane Jewish mysticism called Kabbalah. Other kinds of letter symbolism have to do with which words they begin. A charming bit of lore called the alphabet of creation tells how the letters of the Hebrew alphabet debated among themselves which one should go first. They each made their case, responding to the others in turn, not hesitating to poke fun at some of the funnier looking letters. In the end it was the humble letter Aleph that God judged worthy of going first. Because with Aleph the name of God, Elohim, begins.
Do Jews call their scriptures the Old Testament?
Old Testament is a term originally used by Christians as a convenient way of characterizing the relationship of the Hebrew scriptures to the Christian or Greek Testament. although one might hear the term as a pejorative reference to a revelation once valid but now abrogated and rendered superfluous. Some Jews still speak of the Old Testament as a concession to common usage. Christians generally regard the Hebrew Scriptures as integral to their faith tradition but of secondary authority whenever it is necessary to resolve an apparent conflict or contradiction between the Testaments. For Jews, Tanakh is the only testament.
Why do religious beliefs so often seem to be associated with intolerance?
Human beings dislike shades of gray. We prefer to persuade ourselves that we can keep truth and falsehood neatly separated. There is us and there is them, and we know who has the truth. Stereotyping and demonizing are natural next steps. Not only are they wrong religiously, they are somehow not quite up to our standards of humanity and thus to be pitted if not simply dismissed as irrelevant. Intolerance of religious diversity is a serious historical evil. A force that can easily be exploited by people of ill intent. And yet it costs so little to approach religious pluralism with an open mind. On the other hand, wars are seldom fought for purely religious reasons. Communities of faith often develop side by side in relative harmony. When problems arise, they are almost always initially political, economic, and social. Then, often enough, those who wish to keep the pot boiling invoke age-old religious differences as though they were the cause of every evil. They remind their constituents that if they really want to be loyal, they will not rest until some ancient slight to the faith has been set right. Underneath it all is the awareness that if you want to destroy a people's will, you must attack the most powerful symbols of their identity, some of which are bound to be religious. So, for example, in Bosnia during the 1990s, a major thrust of Serb policy was to obliterate as completely as possible all visible signs of Muslim presence, destroying especially ancient mosques and libraries and leaving paved parking lots in their place.
Are there mythic elements in Confucian tradition or CIT?
Confucius looked to history for lessons about life. The stories he found to have the greatest educative value were those about human beings. The truly great and the mean-spirited alike, who had shaped life in the Middle Kingdom for good or ill. The high exemplars were themselves people, the rulers and sages of old. Like his Indian contemporary the Buddha, Confucius preferred not to commit his time and energy to discrediting the stories of the gods and superhuman heroes of his culture. He was simply convinced that, whatever their powers and prerogatives, the subjects of China's myths could not relieve human beings of their most fundamental responsibilities. The ultimate divine favor, Confucius believed, was a climate in which people could turn their full attention to the everyday realities of family, livelihood, and the betterment of society. Still, under pressure from Taoism and Buddhism. Later Confucians cloaked the birth and life of the master in wondrous tales. A unicorn presaged Confucius' birth by presenting his mother with a tablet of announcement. A pair of dragons and 5 ancient men symbolizing the 5 directions appeared in the heavens on the day he was born. And a celestial musical ensemble provided accompaniment for his birth. CIT likewise did not revolve around mythic narratives as such. Divinely sanctioned representatives of the people under heaven had more pressing concerns. But the emperor had the power to elevate individual heroes and gods from local to universal stature. As a result, he was, ironically perhaps, China's most important myth-maker.
What signs or symbols might identify someone as a deist or practitioner of CCT?
Symbols associated with religious beliefs and folk practices abound in societies heavily influenced by Chinese culture. Over the centuries, the major Chinese religious traditions Taoist, Confucian, Buddhist, and popular have shared many of those symbols and signs. Overlapping of symbols of various traditions makes it difficult, if not impossible, to know at a glance to which tradition the owner and user of the symbols belongs. Signs and symbols generally associated with CCT include a vast range of protective and magical devices, amulets, and talismans. Perhaps the most widely used symbol is that of the perfect harmony of yin and yang, appearing on all sorts of personal items such as rings and pendants. The so-called Taiji, Supreme Ultimate, is a circle in which 2 equal but opposite curving tear shapes embrace. In other words, an S-curve line divides the circle in 2 equal parts. The darker half symbolizes yin, the brighter half yang, but the commingling of the two is symbolized by a dark dot in the larger end of the yang shape and a corresponding bright dot in the yin shape. Sometimes, as on the national flag of South Korea, that symbol is surrounded by the 8 trigrams, Bagwa. The trigrams are made up of combinations of solid yang lines and broken yin lines. Charm-like devices are extremely popular in Chinese societies. Textiles and other decorative items, like ceramic wares, invariably display a range of symbolic features. Symbols they show can include any of dozens of animal, plant, or inanimate objects associated with aspects of the greatest mysteries of life, of those things that human beings most hope for or fear. For example, the tortoise and crane mean long life, the dragon means protection, the phoenix warmth. The heron and countless other birds of good omen betoken happiness. While creatures of ill omen, such as the owl, portend death and bad fortune.
What were the ancient Greek gods and myths?
Between approximately 850 BCE and 500 BCE, there arose a new Greek religion based on the god Zeus and on 11 other gods who resided on Mount Olympus in Thessaly, in northeastern Greece. The Greek gods were adopted later by the Romans and given different names. The 12 gods made up a family: Zeus, Jupiter to the Romans, the ruler, his brothers Poseidon, Neptune, and Hades, Pluto, their sister Hestia, Vesta, who later gave up her place to Zeus's son Dionysus, Bacchus, Zeus's wife Hera, Juno, their son Ares, Mars, Zeus's children Athena, Minerva, Apollo, Aphrodite, Venus, Hermes, Mercury, and Artemis, Diana, and Hera's son Hephaestus, Vulcan. These Olympians were concerned with and controlled the fate of humankind. Many minor gods were believed to reside on earth and to play a part in the drama of the Olympians and their interaction with the Greek mortals. Zeus sometimes fathered children by mortal women, and the sons became the heroes of Greek legend. The Greeks worshipped their gods as a regular part of their everyday lives. They were careful to please the gods in their actions and were especially careful to avoid angering them. When disaster befell their cities or crops, or when sickness took the lives of loved ones, they believed the wrath of the gods was responsible. The Greek gods also had a humorous side, and the mortals were able to laugh at the gods' plots against one another and at their concealed love affairs. The Greek and Roman myths concerning the activities of the gods and mortals are considered some of the world's greatest literature. Outstanding examples include the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. These and other works presented the ideals of physical beauty and heroic deeds in a poetic form that has inspired civilization since their creation.
Did Jesus found Christianity as a distinct religious tradition?
Jesus and the Buddha had this in common: they were both primarily teachers who offered what were judged to be non-traditional interpretations of already ancient traditions. Neither seems to have set out deliberately to found a new religious community, though they both gathered about themselves the nucleus of what would eventually become distinct institutional structures. As such, Jesus and the Buddha were foundational figures rather than founders. Leaders among their immediate communities inherited the task of working out the organizational details. A number of able leaders emerged from the early followers of Jesus. They included in particular Peter, one of the original 12 apostles, and Paul, a Pharisee from Asia Minor who had experienced a dramatic change of religious orientation.
What is an imam?
In Arabic, the word imam means one who is in front. Three distinct meanings are attached to the term. First, and most commonly, imam refers to the individual who leads the ritual prayer in the local mosque. Any mature adult can fulfill the role, and members of local communities frequently share this responsibility. Women may lead prayer and preach to groups of women only. Once local communities become large enough to have the necessary funds, they typically hire a religious scholar to serve as full-time spiritual leader with the more official title of imam, with a capital I. An imam's overall function is roughly similar to that of the pastor of a parish church. He counsels, visits the sick, performs funeral services, and generally administers the affairs of the mosque. To assist him in his work, the community often hires secretaries, directors of education and other services, and teachers, if the mosque sponsors a school. Second, important spiritual and intellectual leaders throughout Islamic history have gained the title imam in recognition of their prominence and accomplishments. In those instances the title is honorary rather than functional. Finally, the term imam refers to the individuals whom the various Shiite communities regard as special spiritual descendants of Muhammad. This narrowest of the three meanings is applied and interpreted in different ways by the major Shiite groups, 12ers, 7ers, and 5ers. Most recently 12er Shiites of Iran and Iraq bestowed the title on the Ayatollah Khomeini in a way that suggested a blend of the second and third meanings explained here.
What are some of the main Protestant communities that arose out of the Reformation?
As a result of the Reformation and associated movements in late medieval Christendom, four large families of Christian communities began to develop. Among the earliest were those identified with the reformer Martin Luther. Today a number of structurally distinct churches, all calling themselves Lutheran, have local branches all over Europe and the United States especially. Out of the reformist teachings of John Calvin have grown a variety of ecclesial bodies. Most notable are the half-dozen or more Presbyterian churches, which trace themselves directly to John Knox, c. 1513–72, a Scottish reformer much influenced by Calvin's thought. The second group are known as the Reformed, including the Evangelical and Reformed churches. A still more varied group of churches developed out of the so-called Radical Reform. From the Anabaptist wing of that movement came the numerous different Baptist churches as well as the Mennonites. From the Congregationalist wing arose the several Congregational churches, from which the United States organizations called the Unitarians and Jehovah's Witnesses split during the 19th century. While the Reformers in Europe organized their various communities, King Henry VIII proclaimed himself head of the Church of England, now no longer obedient to the Bishop of Rome. From that original movement, also known as Anglicanism, have emerged the Protestant Episcopal and Methodist churches. The latter beginning with the teaching of the once Anglican John Wesley, 1703–91.
How do Christians deal ritually with death and mourning?
Death signals the final rite of passage, and most Christian communities have rituals designed specially to help mourners understand their loss from a religious perspective. A more or less formal period of mourning generally follows for a day or two. A few Christian groups do not permit embalming, preferring to bury the body on the day of death or shortly thereafter. American Christians generally prefer to have a wake, usually at a mortuary but sometimes in a church or even in the home, during which mourners offer their condolences to the dead person's family. Wakes can last from several hours to several days. Some groups prefer a memorial service in the mortuary chapel following the wake. Many churches offer funeral rites in church, either as part of a special version of the regular liturgical prayer, as with the Roman and Anglo-Catholic Mass, or as a distinct ceremony. Generally, the body of the deceased is present in the casket, which is sometimes open for a final viewing and generally closed during the funeral ritual itself. When the deceased has willed his or her body to a medical school, or when an immediate cremation is judged necessary, a memorial service is held without the body. In the United States, burial is still the most common means of dealing with human remains. But cremation is gaining acceptance even in churches traditionally opposed to the practice.
How does one know when he or she has crossed the moral divide?
Shame is a very powerful index of morality in Shinto tradition. What members of some traditions identify as moral guilt incurred objectively as a result of some specific act. Shinto tradition regards a breach of social contract for which the individual ought to be ashamed and seek forgiveness through purification.
What does Jesus mean to Muslims?
Jesus is the last of the prophet messengers before Muhammad. Muslims consider him a great teacher, but not more than a human being. Jesus appears in a total of 15 surahs of the Quran. By God's direct intervention, he was the son of the Virgin Mary who spoke as an infant to defend Mary from those who accused her of immorality for becoming pregnant without a legitimate husband. The Quran refers to Jesus as servant of God, Spirit of God, and a word from God. God taught Jesus wisdom, gave him knowledge of the Torah, and strengthened him with the Holy Spirit. Often associated with the angel Gabriel, the revealing angel. Among Jesus' special gifts were the power to raise the dead and heal the sick. Tradition says that Jesus ascended to either the second or the fourth heaven. A special element in Muslim teaching about Jesus is the belief he was not actually crucified. Instead, a look-alike took his place at the last minute, Quran 4:157. But another text mentions his death and resurrection, Quran 19:33.